Picture this. You are standing at the edge of a dusty, sun-baked drag strip in 1959. The air suddenly turns sharp, almost acidic, stinging the back of your throat. Your eyes start watering. Then you hear it. An engine screaming at a pitch that shouldn't even be mechanically possible, producing a violent shock wave of power that defies the laws of internal combustion as you know them. The car violently launches and disappears in a thick cloud of yellow-tinged smoke that smells exactly like model airplane fuel mixed heavily with formaldehyde. What you just witnessed was completely, undeniably illegal. The fuel pumping through that engine was outright banned by the NHRA, punishable by a lifetime suspension from the sport. Yet, every single weekend at tracks across America, racers were secretly pouring this forbidden elixir into their tanks, playing a high-stakes game of chemical cat and mouse with officials. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the underground engineering wars of classic drag racing. If you're someone who obsesses over horsepower, outlaw history, and the absolute limits of mechanical engineering, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, you might be thinking, how does a simple liquid cause a 7-year underground racing war that nearly tore the entire sport apart? Well, here is the thing. To understand the madness, we have to go back to the spark that ignited the powder keg. The year was 1957. We are in Bakersfield, California. A young, brilliant mechanic named Joaquin Arnett was sweating in his dusty garage, meticulously rebuilding a blown Chrysler Hemi engine. Out of nowhere, a buddy of his from the local model airplane club stopped by holding a nondescript 1-gallon metal can. He slid it across the greasy workbench and said, "Try this in your fuel mix. We use it in our little planes. Makes them absolutely scream." What happened next in that garage would trigger the single most controversial and transformative ban in motorsports history. Arnett, curious and always chasing that extra tenth of a second, mixed the clear, oily liquid with his standard racing gas. He started conservative, just a 10% mix at first. When he fired up that Hemi, the engine didn't just run better, it completely transformed. The standard exhaust note changed from a deep, throaty rumble to a violent, crackling shriek. The metal headers glowed cherry red in broad daylight. And the power? Look, the dyno numbers were terrifying. It showed a 40% increase in horsepower from just 10% nitro. By the time Arnett was running 90% nitromethane, his 392 cubic inch Hemi was producing over 800 horsepower. In 1957, that wasn't just fast, that was pure science fiction. But this is where it gets really interesting. Nitromethane wasn't some brand new space-age discovery that fell from the sky. The Germans had actually experimented with it extensively in their V2 rockets during World War II to drastically increase propulsion thrust. The underground model airplane community had been casually using it since the 1940s to get their tiny miniature engines to spin faster. But nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, had seriously tried to run it in a full-size, fire-breathing automobile racing engine. The chemistry behind it was actually simple. Terrifyingly simple if we are being completely honest. Nitromethane, chemically known in the lab as CH3NO2, carries its own internal oxygen atoms right there inside its molecular structure. Here is what most people don't realize about basic internal combustion. While your standard racing gasoline needs about 14.7 parts of air to 1 single part of fuel for perfect combustion, nitro only needs 1.7 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. Think about it like a campfire. Gasoline is like throwing a dry log on the fire and hoping the wind blows hard enough to keep it burning hot. Nitromethane is like soaking that exact same log in liquid oxygen before you even strike the match. Because it needs so phenomenally little outside air, you could literally dump 8 times more physical fuel into each engine cylinder during every single intake stroke. More fuel in the chamber meant vastly more energy released. More energy released meant a truly terrifying amount of raw, unadulterated power. The theoretical horsepower limits were staggering, and these backyard mechanics were just beginning to scratch the surface of what was possible. To truly understand why the authorities panicked and banned nitromethane outright, we desperately need to travel back and look at what professional drag racing looked like in the middle of 1956. The sport was barely organized at this primitive point in history. Safety equipment was practically a joke. A driver's safety gear usually consisted of a leather aviator helmet, some cheap glass goggles, and maybe a lap belt bolted into the floorboards if they were feeling exceptionally cautious. Fire suits? They literally did not exist yet. Roll cages were entirely optional and usually consisted of just a single flimsy hoop of thin steel tubing. Most importantly, engine technology was relatively tame and highly predictable. A competent mechanic could build a Ford flathead V8 that pushed out around 400 horsepower reliably. A truly great, legendary engine builder might squeeze out 450 horsepower on a perfect day with good weather. The playing field was completely level because every single team was ultimately limited by the exact same basic chemistry of gasoline combustion. Track owners could actually get liability insurance for their events without going completely bankrupt. Sanctioning bodies could establish clear, safe, and enforceable rules. Spectators could stand relatively close to the fast-paced action, sometimes right at the very edge of the asphalt track without the looming fear of taking shrapnel to the chest. Drag racing was finally starting to look respectable. And then, nitro unexpectedly arrived. It arrived like a massive nuclear bomb exploding violently at a neighborhood knife fight, instantly changing the trajectory of the sport forever. But the establishment had no idea that their desperate attempt to ban this volatile liquid would accidentally launch the most dangerous underground engineering arms race the world had ever seen. By early 1957, word of Arnett's insane power gains had spread through the California racing scene like a wildfire in dry brush. Every speed-obsessed mechanic from Pomona to Bakersfield wanted a taste of the magic liquid. Racers began frantically mixing nitromethane into their fuel tanks in ever-increasing dangerous percentages. It started with 20%, quickly jumped to 40%, then 60%. Some absolute lunatics bypassed the mixing entirely and were running straight nitro, 100% pure CH3NO2. The immediate results were both spectacular for the crowds and utterly horrifying for the safety officials. Engines that had reliably produced 400 horsepower for an entire season were suddenly violently churning out 800, then an unbelievable 1,000 horsepower. The sheer mechanical forces involved instantly exceeded anything the internal engine parts were ever designed or engineered to handle. This wasn't just pushing the envelope, it was shredding it into a million pieces. But the establishment had no idea that their desperate attempt to ban this volatile liquid would accidentally launch the most dangerous underground engineering arms race the world had ever seen. By early 1957, word of Arnett's insane power gains had spread through the California racing scene like a wildfire in dry brush. Every speed-obsessed mechanic from Pomona to Bakersfield wanted a taste of the magic liquid. Racers began frantically mixing nitromethane into their fuel tanks in ever-increasing dangerous percentages. It started with 20%, quickly jumped to 40%, then 60%. Some absolute lunatics bypassed the mixing entirely and were running straight nitro, 100% pure CH3NO2. The immediate results were both spectacular for the crowds and utterly horrifying for the safety officials. Engines that had reliably produced 400 horsepower for an entire season were suddenly violently churning out 800, then an unbelievable 1,000 horsepower. The sheer mechanical forces involved instantly exceeded anything the internal engine parts were ever designed or engineered to handle. This wasn't just pushing the envelope, it was shredding it into a million pieces. Here's the thing about those early engines. They were built from standard factory-forged metals, but inside a nitro-burning cylinder, The intense pressure spikes were practically nuclear. Heavy steel connecting rods were violently bending and contorting like cheap paper clips under the massive strain. High-compression aluminum pistons were literally melting into a useless molten puddle of liquid metal inside the engine block. Massive, heavy crankshafts were physically snapping clean in half right in the middle of a quarter-mile pass, sending shrapnel flying in every direction. At the famous Lions drag strip in Long Beach, a massively supercharged Oldsmobile running an aggressive 80% nitro mix exploded with such devastating violence that jagged, heavy chunks of the iron engine block were later found deeply embedded in a solid wood telephone pole nearly 200 feet away from the track. The entire racing establishment was absolutely terrified. NHRA President Wally Parks had dedicated years of his life trying desperately to legitimize the rough-around-the-edges sport of drag racing. He wanted to transform it from a reckless, illegal outlaw activity done on dark city streets to a respectable, nationally recognized, and safe motorsport. Insurance companies were already highly skeptical of the sport's inherent dangers. Parks knew that one spectacular, deadly nitro explosion, especially if it injured innocent spectators and was caught on newsreel cameras for the whole country to see, could permanently destroy everything he had painstakingly built. On May 1st, 1957, feeling he had absolutely no other choice, Parks made the controversial announcement that would violently split the entire racing world down the middle. Effective immediately, nitromethane was strictly banned from all NHRA-sanctioned events across the country. Any racer caught sneaking it into their tanks would face an immediate, permanent, and lifetime suspension from the sport. There would be no appeals process and absolutely no exceptions made for anyone. Now, on paper, this sweeping ban seemed entirely reasonable to the casual observer. Nitromethane was genuinely incredibly dangerous stuff. The thick fumes it produced were highly toxic to breathe. Inhaling those fumes in the pits could easily cause a serious medical condition called methemoglobinemia, where your blood literally loses its ability to carry life-sustaining oxygen to your brain. Furthermore, the engine explosions were getting larger, more frequent, and vastly more destructive. Just weeks before the ban, 3 innocent spectators had been severely injured by flying, razor-sharp engine parts at an unsanctioned match race in Pomona. The danger was real. But here's what most people don't realize about the mindset of a dedicated drag racer. Parks had vastly underestimated 2 very crucial, undeniable elements. First, he underestimated the pure, unadulterated addiction the racers had to raw speed. Second, and perhaps more importantly, he severely underestimated the paying fans' deep, primal addiction to the dangerous spectacle of it all. Nitro didn't just make these cars slightly faster on the timing clocks. It completely transformed them into terrifying, fire-breathing monsters that commanded awe and respect. The sheer physical sound was completely otherworldly. It wasn't a rumble, it was a violent, crackling, popping shriek that you felt deep inside your chest cavity before you even heard it with your ears. The raw flames violently shooting from the open exhaust headers could easily be 6 feet long, burning a bright, unnatural yellow-green color in the daylight. The massive tire burnouts created thick, choking clouds of smoke so incredibly dense that they actually looked like solid objects hovering over the starting line. This wasn't just a simple car race anymore. This was pure, unadulterated theater. It was dangerous, it was loud, and it was the exact embodiment of everything that had magnetically drawn young people to hot rodding in the very first place. The fans wanted the fire, the noise, and the sheer unpredictability that only Nitro could deliver. So, faced with a lifetime ban and the sudden loss of their newfound mind-bending horsepower, the racers did exactly what you would expect racers to do when faced with a strict rule. They immediately started aggressively cheating. Within mere weeks of the official ban being announced, underground self-taught mechanics and amateur chemists were desperately developing clever, almost brilliant ways to completely hide nitromethane in their racing fuel. The simplest and most common early method was basic dilution. If a team mixed just 10% pure nitro with standard high-octane racing gas, the mixture was practically undetectable to the naked eye. The sharp, acidic smell was still vaguely there, but it was incredibly faint and easily written off. The performance gain on the track was noticeable to the driver, but not so glaringly obvious that it immediately raised suspicions. Track officials would essentially need sophisticated laboratory equipment to prove a violation definitively. But here is where it gets really interesting. A meager 10% bump wasn't nearly enough for the hardcore racers aggressively chasing national speed records and big cash prizes. They desperately needed more power. So enter the era of the masking agents. Clever mechanics quickly discovered that adding certain specific strong-smelling chemicals to the fuel tank could effectively hide the characteristic pungent smell of nitromethane from the probing noses of the NHRA inspectors. Propylene oxide quickly became a very popular additive. It smelled somewhat similar to nitro to the untrained nose, but it was technically entirely legal under the current rulebook. Other teams began using large doses of benzene, which could effectively mask the sharp, acidic notes of the forbidden fuel. Some desperate teams even went so far as to use large quantities of cheap cologne and perfume. Yes, you heard that right. Actual store-bought perfume. They would literally dump an entire bottle of Old Spice into the fuel tank, making the track smell like a barbershop. But what the officials didn't know was what lurked beneath the scent was a lethal 50% mix of pure nitromethane. Now, you might be thinking, surely the highly trained NHRA officials weren't that easily fooled, right? Well, they really weren't. The sanctioning body quickly realized that relying purely on their noses wasn't going to cut it, so they tried to fight back using actual chemistry. They introduced mandatory randomized fuel checks right at the starting line. Strict inspectors in crisp white shirts would walk right up to a staging car and physically stick a long strip of chemical litmus paper directly into the fuel tank. They were specifically looking for the telltale sudden color change that chemically indicated the highly acidic presence of nitro. But remember, we are dealing with obsessed racers here. They responded almost instantly by secretly adding alkaline chemicals that would perfectly neutralize the pH balance of the fuel mix without killing the horsepower. It was a brilliant, completely invisible countermeasure. So the NHRA escalated the war. They bought expensive, scientific-specific gravity testers, which are basically hydrometers, to check the exact density of the fuel, because nitro is significantly heavier than standard racing gasoline. The racers, they didn't even blink an eye. They simply consulted with local chemical engineers and added specific lightweight hydrocarbon compounds to perfectly match gasoline's exact density on the dot. Look, it literally became a technological arms race right there on the sticky blacktop. For every single detection method the authorities dreamed up, the underground racers had a highly sophisticated countermeasure ready by the very next weekend. But the absolute most elaborate James Bond-level scheme belonged to a legendary drag racing team operating out of Texas. These guys weren't just playing with chemistry, they were completely re-engineering the automobile from the ground up. They meticulously installed a completely hidden secondary fuel system buried deep inside the heavy steel frame rails of the car. The main highly visible fuel tank held 100% legal racing gas for the starting line inspection, but they had hidden high-pressure electric aircraft pumps that would secretly switch the fuel feed over to the hidden nitro tank right after the burnout. And here's where it gets really interesting. The switch wasn't operated manually by the driver. It was ingeniously wired directly into the starting line Christmas tree lights. When that last amber light flashed, the electrical system swapped the fuels completely automatically. By the time the green light hit, the engine was screaming on a deadly mix of outlaw fuel. But honestly, hiding the nitro was only half the battle. The real innovation, the true engineering miracle of this entire era, wasn't in hiding the nitromethane, it was in somehow managing to survive it. Running this volatile, explosive chemical required completely rethinking the fundamental design of the internal combustion engine. Here's what most people don't realize about combustion physics. A standard gasoline engine burns relatively cool, but inside a nitro motor, the combustion temperatures violently exceeded 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit in a fraction of a second. At those extreme temperatures, standard aluminum pistons wouldn't just fail, they would literally melt into liquid slag, exactly like an ice cube dropped onto a white-hot frying pan. To combat this, desperate teams started custom machining heavy, solid forged steel slugs. It was incredibly crude, and it added massive rotating weight to the engine, but it was absolutely effective at surviving the hellish inferno inside the block. Then you had the massive fuel flow problem. The physical requirements were simply staggering to comprehend. A high-performance gasoline engine might use maybe a single gallon of fuel during a full quarter-mile pass. A nitro motor running at full tilt would violently consume up to 5 entire gallons in that exact same distance. The standard automotive fuel pumps designed for gasoline engines couldn't even come close to keeping up with that massive demand. The engines were essentially running out of fuel and violently starving halfway down the track. So racers got creative again. They started scrounging military surplus yards. They adapted high-volume aircraft fuel pumps used in World War II fighter planes. And when those weren't enough, they actually started modifying massive boat bilge pumps. They were using literally anything that could physically move fire hose volumes of volatile liquid under intense pressure. And if you think the fuel system was a complete nightmare, the ignition systems were particularly problematic. You see, nitro didn't just cleanly burn like standard gasoline. It violently detonated. The resulting explosion was so forceful that it would physically blow the spark out, or the sheer volume of liquid fuel would drown the spark plugs entirely, causing them to foul out completely after a single 4-second pass. Some teams had their mechanics frantically changing all 8 spark plugs between every single run, blistering their fingers on the glowing hot metal. Other brilliant innovators developed entirely custom cylinder heads with dual spark plugs, utilizing complex backup ignition systems that would automatically fire a secondary spark when the primary plugs inevitably failed under the immense pressure. The most successful solution they eventually found was a massive magneto system borrowed directly from circle-track sprint cars. These magnetos were producing an unbelievable 44,000 volts of raw electricity. That is enough voltage to easily jump a half-inch physical gap in thin air. But even with aircraft pumps and lightning bolt ignitions, a devastating condition called hydraulic lock was incredibly common. So much raw liquid fuel was being violently dumped into the tiny combustion cylinders that it literally couldn't all burn in time. Since liquid cannot be compressed, when the heavy steel piston came rushing up on the compression stroke, something had to give. The internal pressure was mathematically infinite. Usually, it was a heavy-duty connecting rod that catastrophically failed. The resulting breakages from these overloaded engines were spectacular, and one famous explosion practically leveled a staging lane at San Fernando drag strip. It was a cool Saturday night, and the legendary racer TV Tommy Ivo had his dragster staged on the starting line. He was pushing the absolute limits of mechanical sanity, secretly running a lethal 95% nitromethane mixture crammed into the cylinders by 30 pounds of supercharged boost. The theoretical, calculated power output of that specific engine was hovering somewhere around an unbelievable 1,800 horsepower. The engine held together for exactly 4 seconds. It violently exploded with such catastrophic, earth-shaking force that the massive, heavy metal supercharger was physically ripped cleanly off the engine block, blew straight through the fiberglass hood, sailed high over the packed grandstands, and violently crashed down into the spectator parking lot, crushing the roof of a parked car. Miraculously, nobody in the crowd was hurt. When the smoke finally cleared, the track crew found the massive forged steel crankshaft cleanly snapped into 3 distinct separate pieces. The heavy iron engine block itself was violently split wide open down the middle, looking exactly like a cracked coconut. Yet, despite the immense danger and the constant violent destruction of incredibly expensive machinery, the fans absolutely could not get enough of the spectacle. Look, the attendance figures at unsanctioned, outlaw races that secretly allowed nitro were regularly triple the size of the crowds at the official, heavily policed NHRA gasoline-only events. This put the track promoters in an incredibly difficult, almost impossible position. They faced a stark, brutal choice. Follow the strict NHRA rules, run only gasoline cars and essentially go completely bankrupt from lack of ticket sales, or silently allow the nitro cars to run, pack the grandstands to the absolute brim, and risk permanently losing their official NHRA sanctioning and insurance coverage. Most promoters, being pragmatic businessmen, quietly chose financial survival. Outlaw fuel-altered races became the absolute worst-kept secret in the entire history of American motorsports. Officially, on paper, every single car rolling into the staging lanes was supposedly running on high-octane gasoline. Unofficially, the entire pit area deeply reeked of the sharp, undeniable acidic stench of nitromethane. The situation was completely untenable for the sanctioning body, but amazingly, this precarious underground dance continued unabated for 7 long years. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Those 7 years weren't just a period of stagnation and rule-breaking. It was actually 7 years of rapid, forced technological evolution happening entirely in the dark shadows of the sport. During this massive prolonged ban, the underground nitro racers, forced to experiment in secret, made profound mechanical discoveries that would eventually revolutionize the entire landscape of drag racing. For instance, they discovered, almost by accident, that nitromethane actually physically supercooled the hot intake charge as it rapidly evaporated, which unexpectedly allowed them to run significantly higher compression ratios without causing immediate catastrophic engine failure. They discovered through brutal trial and error that standard composite head gaskets were useless, but custom-made solid copper head gaskets could actually survive the massive violent combustion pressures. They went even further, finding that if they annealed the solid copper, heating it until it was literally glowing cherry red, then slowly letting it cool down over hours, it made the metal just soft enough to perfectly seal the engine block, but incredibly strong enough to completely contain cylinder pressures exceeding 2,000 psi. These outlaw mechanics also developed the first true billet steel crankshafts, painstakingly carved by hand from solid, massive bars of aircraft-grade 4340 chromoly steel, because the standard cast-iron factory cranks kept snapping in half. They created incredibly complex aluminum connecting rods perfectly paired with lightweight titanium wrist pins, desperately saving crucial rotational weight in the fast-moving reciprocating assembly. Every single major innovation during this era was born strictly from absolute necessity, driven entirely by the desperate burning need to survive just one more violent, chaotic pass down the track on the devil's fuel. And it wasn't just the hard parts. The chemistry got incredibly sophisticated too. Racers quickly learned that running 100% pure nitromethane was actually too powerful and wildly unpredictable. It would violently detonate so quickly and with such sheer force that literally no engine block on Earth could physically contain the explosion. So these amateur chemists learned to carefully add just 1 to 2% distilled water to the mix, which scientifically slowed the chemical burn rate down just enough to keep the engine from instantly grenading. They also discovered that standard methanol could be perfectly mixed with nitro to create a far more manageable, stable racing fuel. A specific 60-40 mix of nitro to methanol quickly became the absolute sweet spot. It was violently powerful enough to completely dominate the competition, but just stable enough to actually cross the finish line with the engine still in one piece. However, some absolutely crazy teams completely ignored these safety margins and eagerly experimented with an even more volatile chemical compound called nitropropane. Nitropropane was scientifically proven to be even more violently powerful than nitromethane, but it was so incredibly, terrifyingly unstable that it could literally detonate inside the fuel tank just from a tiny spark of static electricity generated by a mechanic's dry shirt. After 2 different, highly experienced racers were tragically killed in massive nitropropane explosions before even making it to the starting line, even the most hardcore, rule-breaking outlaw tracks permanently banned it. Meanwhile, the supercharged engines themselves rapidly evolved into something entirely unrecognizable from their factory origins. Engine compression ratios steadily climbed from a mild 8-to-1 to a radical 12-to-1, and finally to a completely insane 15-to-1. The massive supercharger overdrive ratios went from a conservative 10% overdriven to 50% to a screaming 100%. Consider this, a massive 671 blower originally engineered to slowly and steadily move air for a heavy, low RPM Detroit diesel truck engine was suddenly being violently spun at a mind-bending 12,000 RPM, shrieking loudly like a military jet turbine engine right behind the driver's head.
The custom fuel injection systems required to feed these monsters became mechanical masterpieces of analog engineering. A typical Hilborn mechanical injection setup specifically designed for nitro had exactly 42 individual tiny brass fuel jets, each one painstakingly and precisely hand-calibrated. The main bypass pill physically controlled the massive overall fuel flow, while the high-speed bypass critically managed the top-end fuel mixture, so the engine wouldn't lean out and melt at 200 miles per hour. Mechanics could change individual port nozzles between rounds to perfectly balance the exact temperature of each specific cylinder. It was true analog mechanical computing at its absolute finest, brilliantly using complex fluid dynamics to instantly solve incredibly difficult performance equations. But the human cost of this underground evolution was mounting rapidly, and the bodies were beginning to pile up.
Look, between 1957 and 1963, a staggering 17 different drivers were tragically killed in nitro-related racing accidents across the country. And the brutal reality was that these deaths weren't always from high-speed crashes into the wall. The brilliant mechanic Lloyd Scott died instantly when his massive engine violently exploded on the starting line and a jagged, broken connecting rod shot straight through his chest like a bullet. The legendary Art Malone was tragically killed when thick, toxic nitro fumes completely filled his cockpit, causing him to instantly pass out behind the wheel during a fast run. His speeding car went straight off the deep end of the track at roughly 140 miles per hour, completely out of control. Adding to the horror, the track firefighting techniques of the era were woefully, almost criminally inadequate for the chemical nightmares they were facing. Standard track water simply wouldn't extinguish a roaring nitro fire because the volatile fuel chemically carried its own oxygen supply and would literally burn underwater. Desperate drag strips hurriedly started stocking large barrels of dry dirt and sand, which was practically the only thing that could effectively smother the intense chemical flames of a nitro explosion. The undeniable, massive turning point in this underground war finally came at the prestigious 1963 U.S. Nationals in Indianapolis. Officially, this was the biggest NHRA event of the year, governed by strict, inflexible gasoline-only fuel regulations. Unofficially, every single person in the massive crowd, including the officials, absolutely knew the top cars were secretly running heavy loads of nitro. The massive crowd was well over 40,000 screaming fans, easily the largest single gathering in drag racing history at that time. In the highly anticipated top eliminator final round, the legendary Don Garlits pulled up to face off against the brilliant Jack Chrisman. Both of these massive, terrifying cars were clearly, undeniably running on heavy nitromethane. The violent, crackling sound alone gave it away to anyone within a 3-mile radius. As the two cars slowly staged, high-ranking NHRA officials stood frozen right at the starting line. They were deeply torn between strictly enforcing their own rigid rulebook, which would mean disqualifying the two biggest stars in the sport and facing a massive riot from 40,000 angry fans, or just looking the other way and letting the spectacular show go on. They chose survival. They stepped back and let them run. Garlits violently launched and won the race with an incredible 7.78-second pass at an astonishing 198 miles per hour, making it the very first official sub-8-second quarter-mile pass in NHRA competition history. The massive crowd went absolutely insane, shaking the grandstands. NHRA President Wally Parks stood silently in the tall timing tower, watching his sport's undeniable future rapidly unfold right before his eyes. He realized he had two stark choices: continue fighting a brutal, losing war against his own racers, or finally embrace the terrifying monster they had created. On January 1st, 1964, Parks officially waved the white flag and publicly announced that nitromethane was finally legal again, but there were strict, major restrictions. The NHRA mandated a maximum 85% chemical concentration of nitro. They also instituted strict mandatory safety equipment rules, including thick, fire-resistant suits for all drivers, heavy arm restraints to keep limbs inside the roll cage during a crash, and sophisticated onboard chemical fire suppression systems.
They mandated heavily reinforced, thick steel bell housings specifically engineered to contain massive clutch explosions. And they instituted strict chassis certification programs to ensure the cars actually had the structural integrity to handle the immense speeds. The outlaw racers had finally won their long war, but it came at a significant cost. The lawless, Wild West days of drag racing were officially over. Nitro was now legal, but it was heavily regulated. The NHRA officially created the top fuel class as a completely professional top-tier division, complete with season points championships and race purses finally large enough to actually support full-time professional racing teams. The brilliant underground technology that had been secretly developed in dark garages for 7 years suddenly exploded into the mainstream light. Within a single year, practically every competitive top fuel team in the country was running slight variations of the exact same basic, highly successful formula: 85% pure nitro, 15% methanol, and exactly 1% of highly guarded mystery additives that absolutely nobody in the pits would ever discuss out loud. The engine configurations rapidly standardized around the massive 426 Chrysler Hemi, heavily bored and stroked out to a massive 500 cubic inches. The superchargers were gigantic 1471 units, violently forcing an unbelievable 3,000 cubic feet of dense air per minute directly into the engine. Overall power outputs quickly exceeded 2,000 raw horsepower. Quarter-mile times plummeted well below the 7-second mark. Top speeds rapidly approached an unbelievable 220 miles per hour. But here is what most people don't realize. The real lasting revolution wasn't just in the incredible speed numbers. It was in the fundamental approach to the entire sport. The brutal 7-year nitro ban had violently forced these backyard mechanics to become highly sophisticated, self-taught engineers. They couldn't just casually bolt on random aftermarket parts and hope for the best anymore. They were forced to deeply understand complex combustion chemistry, advanced metallurgy, and intricate fluid dynamics. They had to constantly think about critical heat dissipation, intense structural stress analysis, and destructive harmonic frequencies that could tear an engine apart. The sport rapidly went from relying on basic mechanical aptitude to applying intense, highly advanced applied science. The legendary crew chiefs who successfully emerged from those dark ban years, brilliant minds like Keith Black, Ed Pink, and Don Garlits himself, weren't just simple mechanics anymore. They were highly innovative, self-taught engineers who just happened to apply their genius to building insanely fast race cars. And the technical innovations just kept coming at a blistering pace. Racers discovered through trial and error that massively retarding the ignition timing could actually prevent catastrophic engine detonation at incredibly high supercharger boost levels. They learned that custom-made copper spark plug washers would compress and seal the combustion chamber far better than standard steel ones under immense pressure. They found that carefully anodizing the raw aluminum supercharger rotors significantly reduced internal friction and dangerous heat buildup. Look, every single tiny, seemingly insignificant improvement absolutely mattered when you were constantly pushing raw materials to their absolute, breaking physical limits. The fuel system evolution was particularly clever and fascinating. Teams smartly realized that the intense natural cooling effect of liquid nitro could actually be used strategically to their advantage. By purposely injecting extra unburned fuel directly into the engine during the pre-race burnout, they could effectively supercool the entire internal engine block, which then allowed for far more aggressive ignition timing and massive boost levels during the actual high-speed run. This led directly to the development of incredibly complex, staged fuel systems that would completely revolutionize how cars accelerated down the track, delivering different fuel mixtures for different parts of the run to maximize power while barely preventing catastrophic failure. The safety improvements born from this era were equally revolutionary and changed the entire automotive landscape. The strict new bell housing regulations directly led to the rapid development of thick, exotic titanium shields that could reliably contain a massive 40-pound steel flywheel violently exploding at 8,000 RPM. The mandatory fire suit requirements fiercely drove massive innovation in advanced material science. early primitive fire suits were made of heavy, highly toxic asbestos, which was incredibly effective at stopping fire but horribly carcinogenic. This urgent need for safety directly spurred the development of Nomex as a lightweight, safe alternative, a highly advanced meta-aramid material that simply wouldn't melt or burn under intense heat. The sophisticated new onboard fire suppression systems utilize advanced halon gas, which would instantly displace all oxygen in the driver's compartment and violently extinguish massive chemical fires in milliseconds. These specific life-saving innovations would eventually spread outward to profoundly impact all forms of global motorsport. But the sheer economic impact of legalizing nitro was absolutely staggering. Before the ban in 1957, a highly competitive drag racing operation could comfortably run on roughly $10,000 a year. By the end of 1965, the top professional teams were easily spending over $100,000 per season. A single custom-built race engine cost $15,000. Some teams were violently destroying up to 6 complete engines in a single race weekend. The sport had professionalized literally overnight. Major corporate sponsors appeared almost instantly. Massive oil companies, Detroit auto manufacturers, and massive speed equipment firms started pouring real money into the sport. Major television coverage quickly followed. ABC's famous Wide World of Sports started nationally broadcasting the massive NHRA Winter Nationals to millions of homes. The official race purses rapidly grew from hundreds of dollars to thousands, and then quickly to tens of thousands of dollars.
But let's get back to the sheer technical mastery that made all of this mind-bending speed physically possible. The custom engines running nitromethane in the mid-1960s were casually producing specific power outputs that wouldn't be matched by multi-million-dollar Formula One engineering teams for another 20 solid years. We're talking about an unbelievable 4 horsepower per single cubic inch of engine displacement. To put that into perspective, that is the naturally aspirated equivalent of an 8,000 horsepower street engine. The sheer physical stress placed on the internal engine components was practically unimaginable. Heavy steel connecting rods were violently experiencing over 10,000 Gs of sheer acceleration. The pistons were violently accelerating from 0 to roughly 100 miles per hour and aggressively snapping back to 0 in less than 2/100ths of a second, repeating this violent process roughly 15,000 times per minute. The mechanical solutions these teams developed were incredibly elegant in their sheer absolute brutality. Since standard aluminum simply couldn't survive the heat, they used heavy forged steel. Since solid steel was far too heavy to spin fast, they strategically machined it paper thin. Since thin steel would violently flex and break under power, they began utilizing incredibly exotic aerospace alloys. Custom titanium connecting rods suddenly appeared, costing an unbelievable $2,000 each in 1960s money. They were 40% lighter than standard steel, but massively stronger than anything else commercially available on the planet. Look, the transformation wasn't just strictly mechanical. The human element evolved drastically too. Driving a volatile nitro car required a completely different, almost superhuman skill set. The sheer acceleration off the starting line was so violently intense that drivers would instantly experience profound tunnel vision as the blood rushed from their heads. They had to quickly learn to navigate the car almost entirely by peripheral vision and raw gut instinct. The intense mechanical vibration was so fierce that the dashboard instruments were completely unreadable blurred messes. Drivers successfully navigated their runs by simply counting the seconds in their head and deeply feeling the engine's distinct rhythm vibrating through the chassis. Some drivers actually wore heavy-duty boxing mouthguards just to prevent their teeth from violently chattering loose and breaking. The G-forces easily peaked at over 5 Gs on the launch, which is more than enough force to make taking a single breath practically impossible. By 1970, just 6 short years after its official legalization, Top Fuel racing had drastically evolved into something completely unrecognizable from its gritty, bootleg origins. Engines were reliably producing well over 3,000 horsepower. Quarter-mile times had plummeted deep into the mid-6-second range.
Top speeds casually exceeded 240 miles per hour. The sport had completely professionalized. Teams now employed full-time, college-educated engineers, advanced chemists, and expert metallurgists. But here's the thing about nitromethane that nobody talks about. It democratized speed in a profound way that literally nothing else in automotive history could have ever accomplished. Before nitro, going incredibly fast required either massive engine displacement or highly exotic European engineering. Both were incredibly expensive, and both heavily favored established factory teams with massive deep pockets. Nitro completely shattered that equation. A highly intelligent blue-collar mechanic with a solid, basic understanding of chemistry could literally take a cheap junkyard engine and force it to produce supercar power. Yes, it might only survive one single pass. Yes, it was incredibly dangerous, but for 6 glorious seconds, that amateur backyard builder could run neck and neck with the biggest factory teams in the world. It was the pure, unadulterated American dream distilled entirely into liquid form.
The brutal ban years from 1957 to 1963 weren't just about stubborn rebels breaking rules. They were fundamentally about sheer innovation under extreme pressure and rapid evolution through forced adversity. Every single major technical advancement in modern drag racing can trace its very roots directly back to those 7 dark years when racers were desperately forced to hide their greatest weapon. The crucial safety equipment we casually take for granted today, the advanced material science that makes modern 10,000 horsepower engines physically possible, the incredibly complex fuel system technology that manages violent combustion at the molecular level, it all started directly with outlaws secretly mixing model airplane fuel in their dark, greasy garages. The legendary story of nitromethane isn't just about advanced chemistry or complex engineering. It's fundamentally about basic human nature. If you firmly tell someone they absolutely cannot do something, they will inevitably find 10 different ways to do it anyway. If you strictly ban a substance, they will brilliantly figure out exactly how to hide it. If you try desperately to control raw innovation, it will simply happen underground, evolving significantly faster and vastly more dangerously than if you had just regulated it properly from the very start. The NHRA learned this incredibly hard lesson the brutal way. They desperately tried to force the genie back into the bottle, but the genie had already granted way too many wishes. Speed, power, spectacle. Once the racers had fully tasted exactly what nitro could do, there was absolutely no going back. The next time you hear a modern top fuel car violently fire up, when that massive wave of sheer sound forcefully hits your chest and the very ground violently shakes beneath your feet, remember that you're directly experiencing the enduring legacy of pure outlaws. Every single precision component in that massive engine, every advanced safety feature on that car, every strict procedure in the pits exists solely because someone, somewhere, flatly refused to accept that nitromethane was just too dangerous to use. They bravely found a way to tame the untamable, to strictly control the completely uncontrollable, to brilliantly turn volatile liquid explosives into manageable horsepower. It tragically took 7 long years of dark underground development, 17 lost lives, and countless violently blown engines, but they actually did it. They completely turned strict prohibition into massive progress, rigid restriction into pure innovation, and the highly banned substance into the absolute foundation of modern drag racing. That is the real, lasting lesson of the nitromethane ban. Innovation absolutely doesn't stop when you make something illegal. It just gets vastly more creative. What legendary automotive rebellion do you think changed the sport forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of the innovators who refuse to follow the rules.